All right, guys, here we are with our first instance of this classroom setting in Intro to Philosophy, right? So this is going to be, remember, a little different than normal if you've taken different courses with me aside from possibly the logic course. Again, be ready for some student interaction. They may say some things that we're not used to hearing folks say. That's okay. Remember, we're trying to get the philosophy in their minds just as much as we are our minds, right? Something to take note, just so you know, if you don't understand what a student is saying, say you can't hear them very clearly, that's okay. It's not that much. It's not a big deal at all. You're not going to lose any of the context of what's being discussed. So if you can't, I'm not saying this happens, but if you're not able to hear this a particular student ask the question, don't worry. Usually, the context will draw out what was said. Like I said, don't think that's going to happen, but it may. So, but don't worry about it if you can't really pick that up. Now we're about to go into this, right? So go ahead and get ready, and let's start with our first discussion in our introduction to philosophy. Did I say uh, coloscopy? Is that a word? Is that something you want to have done? All right. So get ready for our first lesson here with Intro to Philosophy. What is truth?
All right. So, what do you think would have to be the first thing we talk about in this class?
How do we know the truth?
That's how do we know truth? That might let's even more fundamental than that. Right, defining what truth is, but even under that, more fundamental than that. What's this mean? God said this a long time ago. This is that. We're in the Bible Belt, so probably somebody knows what this means. Quidus veritas. What's that mean? You may know. Come on, Bible Belt guys.
What is true?
What is truth? Who asked that? Go ahead, you know?
I just said what is truth because it looks similar enough to Spanish stuff.
Or Spanish looks similar to that, right? Because that's all.
Yeah. Yeah.
A guy named what? Pontius Pilate. Who's heard of that guy? Asked a guy named Jesus this when? Roughly 2,000 years or so ago, right? So is this a new question? Quidus veritas? No? It's an old question, right? So, what is it? Does it exist? Right? So that's what we're going to talk about. Does truth exist? And hopefully this thing will die before it's already dead. Anyway, who thinks that truth does exist? You think truth exists? Think truth exists? Who thinks it doesn't exist? Who thinks there's no such thing as truth? What is it? If we had to give an example, or if not an example, we don't want to give an example, we want to talk about the essence of what it is. What do you think truth is? A fact? What else? No, you got to stop. Right? Don't talk all at once because it confuses me. Go ahead.
The description of something that exists.
That actually fits under one definition of truth, right? All right, what else might it be? How about this? Did you know that there's different theories of truth? There's not necessarily just one theory of truth. There's different theories of truth. So let's kind of talk about those first before we hone in on one particular theory. There's one theory called the pragmatic theory. Sorry, this thing doesn't work. Pragmatic. What does it mean if something's pragmatic? It works, right? If something's pragmatic, it means it's work. It works. So what do you think this theory? And we're going to be very general in these. We're not going to get into the super details of these. But so generally speaking, what do you think this pragmatic theory of truth says? The truth is that which what? Works. Whatever works is true, right? This is probably the American contribution to the theory of truth. along with some others, a guy named James Beauty came up with this basic concept. We hear this all the time, do we not, in our culture? Hey man, whatever works for you, right? That's essentially this. Whatever works is true, right? All right, one of the other theories that we have, and we'll talk about some of these too if you got any questions, is the coherence theory. What do you think this coherence theory means about truth?
Like in the understanding.
Well, we understood, but what else? What does to cohere mean? Well, not necessarily. I mean, it would be understandable, right? But what do you think? What does it mean if something coheres? Right, it fits together, right? So under this theory, and again, we're being oversimplistic here, but under this theory, the coherence theory is that which coheres. So if it can make sense of what? If this fact makes sense in light of what? This fact. This data makes sense in light of this data. This data makes sense in light of this data. That's what? It's coherent, right? It makes sense. There's no contradictions there. It all fits together nicely. It's like a puzzle of some sort. So that theory of truth says whatever makes sense of all the data in a way that's coherent is what's true. All right, so that's your next one. Then the next one would be something like the consensus theory. All right, the consensus theory. Now this doesn't take a degree, a college degree to figure out what consensus means. What do you think this theory means? Or how this tries to encapsulate truth? What is true?
A whole lot of people agree on it.
Right, what you can get the majority, what the majority accepts to be true is what? Is true, right? Something like that. All right, lastly, before we get into our other, and this is going to be related to this one, all these are similar, all of them are sort of related, right? Is the constructivist theory. Constructivist theory. This is kind of going to fit into some of your postmodernistic types of philosophies and theories of truth. What do you think constructivist theory might entail? Basically, what a society constructs, right? Whatever the society comes to agree with, what society is based on in some loose sort of sense, right there. Now, you see how that's related to this theory here, right? You see how this theory is related to this, especially how these two are related, pragmatic and coherent, right? Now, should the truth work? If something's true, should it work? Right, at least in the long run, right? If something's true, should it be coherent? Should it make sense of data? Sure, right? Well, does this seem to have anything to do with the truth at all?
That could be totally wrong. You could have
All right, but what are you assuming right now, though? Well, that you're assuming that truth exists, right?
Oh.
Because if you're wrong, if a bunch of people are wrong, what has to be true? That there's truth, right? Because how can you be wrong if there's no truth? Right, so first, before we can just knock this, see how that's common sense. You won't say, wait a minute, this doesn't necessarily seem right? But in order to think this isn't right, you have to assume what? The very question we're asking, right? Does truth even exist? All right, so constructivist theory, same sort of, a priori or on the surface, on the face of it, kind of critique, we would get something like this, right? So, having said these, which one of these do you think probably that you would align with most likely? All right, what about you other guys? Coherence? All right, let's say, who's watched a movie? That should be like, who's watched a really, really good movie? Probably, hopefully most people, right? Was that movie? That's how you hear me combine words here, it's too early. What? Was the movie coherent? Sure it was, right? Like you watched the movie, it made complete sense. Like all the facts in the movie made sense with all the other facts, in the movie, right? Or same thing with a story in a book, right? You read a book, read some sort of novel or whatever. All of it makes sense. Now, was it true? Could the story be completely made up? Yeah. So just because something's coherent or makes complete sense, what? Doesn't necessarily mean that it's reflective of reality, right? Right. So now again, should truth do this? Yeah, it should, right? So, but if you're trying to base your entire theory of the truth off of this, does that seem like a good basis? Because can I make up? All right, say you got the guy who's completely lost his mind. He thinks he's Napoleon, right? And he's walking around in the mental institution right now, claiming that he's Napoleon.
Napoleon.
Now, one of the craziest things about those kind of people is for everything you say to them, what do they have? Huh? Right, but a comeback that what? Well, it makes sense. You're like, hey, I'm Napoleon. Hey, look, man, nobody here thinks you're Napoleon. And then he says, right, because nobody wants me to know that I'm really Napoleon. You see how that's insane? But but does that make sense? Yeah, that's coherent. Well, if everybody was trying to hide my identity, well, then of course everybody would act like that I'm not Napoleon, right? But does that mean that what he's saying is true? But it's completely what? It's completely coherent. And we could go on with that example all day long with anybody that's in sort of some conspiracy type theory, right? You can come up with a conspiracy theory, and for everything that you say, they can have a response that makes sense with their theory. But that what? Doesn't mean what? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, right? Now, should the truth be coherent? Sure. But can this be a basis for what the truth is? No. Consensus, I was kind of, mashed on that earlier, but already we can kind of see that, wait a minute. Yeah, we can have a vast consensus that thinks what? Something is true and it not necessarily be true, right? So we can all believe that slavery is a perfectly legitimate system to build a society upon. And the majority of people agree with that. Does that mean it's necessarily true? No, not necessarily. Constructivists, basically the same sort of thing. And this is going to fall into what's called postmodern. Postmodernism, at its most foundational, or the nuts and bolts of it, it's going to say simply, the most radical version of it's going to say simply that there is no such thing as truth, that there is no truth. And if there is truth, it's going to have to be something like constructivist, or it's going to have to be something like consensus. That's what truth has to be, because they're going to say that there is no truth. Now, pragmatic theory, should the truth work? Yeah, it should work, right? But because something works, does that mean it's true? Why? Give me an example. Why? Do lies work? Yeah, lies work all the time, right? Lies can work all of the time, all day long, right? Now, eventually they may break down, but do they work? And can they work for years? Sure they can. Historical revisionism is just what? First, what is historical revisionism? Historical revisionism, Historical revisionism is just when somebody goes back essentially and rewrites history, right? So like the guys now that all the eyewitnesses are starting to die off from that generation are starting to come along and say things like the Holocaust never happened, things like that. That's historical revisionism. So when they try to explain all their facts, does that work in that sense? Yeah, it works. But is it true? Did the Holocaust not happen? Right? That doesn't necessarily mean that's true just because their theory works. Or think about this. Think about in the Middle Ages when we had certain theories about the way the universe worked. Say, for instance, like now we know that this is a geocentric or heliocentric universe, right? Our solar system. Our solar system is heliocentric.
My
It's not
favorite.
geocentric, meaning the universe or our solar system doesn't revolve around the Earth, right? So, if you'll remember from some of your science classes or physics classes or physical science classes, that when they were looking at the stars, they would see certain rotations in the planet called an ellipse, Well, when they would see them move, in order to explain the data, they were like, well, look, this is all rotating around us. But there's this one particular, I forget what star, I forget what planet it was, or, a satellite of some sort. It would seem like it was moving the opposite way sometimes. Now, well, wait a minute, that can't possibly be true if everything's revolving around us. So they created this ingenious way to describe what was happening. And it was, if you were looking down on it, it looked like it was one like this. If you were looking out at the stars, it looks like it would go this way sometimes, and then sometimes it would go this way. But I'm like, wait a minute, that can't possibly be right if everything revolved around us. So they came up with this elaborate system, this ingenious system, that now pretend like you're looking straight down on the universe, straight down on our solar system. Here's the Earth, here's everything that revolves around us, right? All the planets, everything revolving around us, we're in the center. So this theory that when something was going this way and that way, what it really was doing was going on in its own tiny little orbit. So see, from our view, it would look like it's going this way, but really what's it doing? It's still going around us, but just doing what? Right, just going in its own tiny little orbit. Like, that was ingenious. And it worked. That worked, right? But was it true? No, it wasn't true. But it was unbelievable in the way it explained the data at the time. It worked. So should the truth work, ultimately speaking? Yeah. But just because something works, does that mean that it's true? Not necessarily. Again, like this up here. Wasn't necessarily true, right? Even though it worked nicely, right? Now let's get to the last theory of truth.
This is the big one.
The last theory, the theory that I hope that you will adopt in this writer's thoughts, is the correspondence theory of truth. What do you think a correspondence theory is? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Correspondence theory is that which what? That which corresponds to reality is true. That which corresponds to reality is true. Now, what does this assume? There's a huge assumption here. Go ahead, Piper. Or that we can what? That we can know reality. Right? Why is, do you see how big that is? This says that whatever matches reality is true. So if you have an idea, that which corresponds to its object, truth is that which corresponds to its object. So if you have some idea about reality, and your idea matches what? Reality, then your idea is what? True, right? The truth is the relationship between your idea and reality. If this idea matches reality, then this idea, the relationship is what? True, right? Does that make sense? Reality is the truth maker, if that's what, if to put it in another way, to use philosophical jargon. Is reality is the truth maker of your idea. So if your idea matches that, then reality is what grounds your idea to being true. Or if I make a claim of some sort, if I make some sort of claim, and my claim matches what? Reality, then my claim is what? Right, so this is the common sense view. This is the view of, say, Aristotle, classical philosophical view. Aristotle, Plato, those kind of guys. And so this is the camp that I sit in. It's the Aristotelian camp. I'm what you would call an Aristotelian Thomas. That's the angle that I'm going to come from this. But I'm not going to come from this just because I like it. I'm going to try to show you the way to view reality is the correspondence theory of truth. So Aristotle was called the common sense philosopher for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is because, you've got types of philosophers, because this class ain't going to be one of these kind of classes. In some ways, it's going to battle you in some ways. But in a lot of ways, you're going to like this class because Aristotle was a philosopher of common sense, meaning that, again, a lot of classes will come in here, the first thing they'll do is say, how do you know there's a desk right here? Which is an epistemological question, like how do we know, right? That kind of question. How do you know there's a desk right here? And then so the whole rest of the class, we're going to make everybody feel like an idiot because what if, and I can play that game too, to make you really wonder if there's a desk right here, right? So the first thing we might do is something like Descartes says, well, how do you know you're not dreaming right now? That, all those sorts of things. We can just go, it's just intellectual judo, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Aristotle's the guy that says, I know there's a desk right there. And the philosopher professor says, how do you know? He says, because there's a freaking desk right there. I can freaking see the desk, right? Here's a desk, moron. So Aristotle says, but I'm not going to play it that way. I'm going to give you intellectual ammunition to be able to argue with the guy that wants to argue with you what? The non-common sense view, right? Now, does that mean that common sense is always right? No, not at all. Not at all. But his point is that if there's no good reason to reject the common sense view of reality, then you better have a hell of an argument, right? Because my premise, or this being my evidence that there's a desk here, you've got to have stronger evidence to show me that's not here, right? And it's got to be airtight, because this, at least on the surface, is what? Airtight evidence, right? I have a very good reason to think there's a desk right here. If you want me to think there's not, you've got to give me a freaking good reason to believe there's not a desk right here. And it's got to be better than saying I'm just dreaming, right? And we'll get to all that when we talk about epistemology. So the common sense view is just simply, if I say there's a book in my hand, and there's a book in my hand, what does that mean? It's true, right? So there's nothing tricky in that sense about truth, right? Now, a lot of philosophers will be like, oh, no, I don't want to hear that. Well, that's just the way it is. Again, or like your mom used to say, you just tell it like it is. That's just a layman's version of what? The definition of what? The correspondence theory of truth. If someone's telling it like it is, they're just what? The correspondence theory of truth. In fact, this is the theory of truth that you grow up with your entire life, that you hold to until you come what? To college, right? And someone has to talk you out of this. This is the view you've held your entire life, right? Now, how do we defend a view like this? Well, why do I think that this? Let's do it this way. Not just I don't want to just jump into let me defend this view, but I want to show you why I think that this view is true. Like why there's good reason to hold to the correspondence theory of truth. Let me check this notes here, because I'm basically just doing this all off memory, and I want to make sure that I'm at least following some sort of outline so you guys won't get confused. Let me go ahead and skip down to this. All of this hinges on this entire theory of truth hinges on what's called the law of non-contradiction. And you're going to see everything that we talk about in this course, every single thing is going to hinge off this one lecture today and what we talk about today. In fact, before we talk about this part, if we can't know the truth, then why are you in college? Why are you here?
Aha.
Think about that. If you have a particular professor or whoever else, if they try to argue that we can't know the truth, or you can't know the truth is relative, and all this thing, what are you doing in there? Why not go home and pound your Coors Light in front of the TV and turn into a turd, right? If that's what's true for you, right?
Really?
Why bother trying to get answers on a test right? If what? If you can't know the truth, right? In fact, when someone lies to you, what are you both assuming? That there's a truth that what? That you're going what? Against, right? That there's something called the truth that you're going against. So it's funny how a lot of times people will say, well, truth is relative, or you can construct your own truth, but then somebody lies to them, what happens all of a sudden? What do? They immediately revert back to what? Right? They'll hold one of these theories down here until they get lied to, and they jump right back up here, right? Something like that. So let's talk about how this correspondence theory it turns completely on this fundamental principle of all thought. You've got three fundamental principles of thought. I call them basically they're just the laws of life. The first is just this, the law of non-contradiction. Sometimes it's called the principle of non-contradiction, or just the principle of contradiction. 2, law of excluded middle. 3 is, I want to say yes, law of identity. Law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, law of identity. Now, right now, all of these are basically describing, in one way or other, they're describing this one particular theme from three different angles. So right now, what we're really going to be worried about is the law of non-contradiction.
Like a diamond.
And the reason I'm having to skip over this book, what your book does right here, is because your book didn't even bother with any of this. Didn't even bother with it. But to me, this is the fundamental part of everything, right? You can't have an argument, you can't have a discussion, you can't have a class about anything unless what? We can know the truth, right? That's logically speaking, that's logically prior to anything else about ethics, about the existence of God, about whatever else is what? That we can know what? The truth. For instance, what good does it do to have an argument about, say, whether or not God exists if what? If you can't know the truth, right? Or what good is it for us to talk about ethical principles if what? There is no truth, right? What point is it to argue about what's right and wrong, how you ought to behave or how you ought not to behave if what? If under that you what? Somebody comes along and says, hey, I'm glad you're honest, but you can't know the truth. Right? So that's logically prior to all of those things, important as those questions are, fundamentally is, can we even know truth? Because there's no sense in sitting in this classroom or any other classroom unless what? You can know the truth about stuff, right? So back to this law of non-contradiction. Aristotle, man, y'all are going to hear me talk about this guy all the time. He's just unbelievably genius because this is the guy, again, who sat around and sit around. He's called the peripatetic, something like that teacher, because he's always walking around with people while he's talking and stuff. But anyway, he's the guy that recognized these things, that pointed out these things, discovered these things. A lot of people say, oh, well, we invented logic. No, you can't invent logic even when you invent the sunshine, right? You discover. So this is the first thing that Aristotle runs into, that he discovers to build off of. He says, look, man, there's got to be this fundamental principle of the way we think, of the way reality works, all of these things. And it's called the law of non-contradiction. And he said, you can't argue for this law of non-contradiction. Meaning we can't get into a philosophical debate in the sense of trying to prove this law. Why? Does anybody know what Aristotle says?
Self-evident.
And again, I know that I don't want you to tune out because this is going to be so big for the whole rest of the course. He says you can't prove this. Why? Because you have to assume it every single time you use it. Or anytime you do anything, what do you have to do? Aristotle would say. You have to use this with every thought you make, with everything you do, with every decision you do, every single thing you do from the time you're asleep, full circle, your dreams, everything. The way reality is, its most basic level has to operate on this principle right here. The law of non-contradiction. What do you think I mean by that? What do you think the law of non-contradiction means? What do you think that entails? You're going to love this because you're going to start thinking this way over time. Like I remember, man, when I started getting into this stuff, I would literally be driving on the road, freaking rocking out, and there'd be like some guy on the radio, and I would say, he's violating the law of non-contradiction. That can't possibly make any sense. So let me give you an example. There's this old song called by Depeche Mode. And I was riding on the road. That's my riding on the road. So when I was riding, he says on there, he says, words are very unnecessary. They can only do harm. What's wrong with that? Words are very unnecessary. They can only do harm. Right, why do you say that? Right? If words are unnecessary, then you can't use words to say that words are unnecessary.
Yeah.
That's a violation of what? The law of non-contradiction. Right? Because if it's true that words are unnecessary, if that's true, then it can't be true that words are unnecessary because they have these words that are necessary to make his point. Right? That's a violation of the law of non-contradiction. Right? Or here's the most easy example of this. I can't speak a word of English. What did I just do? I had to speak words in English to say I can't speak a word in English. I violated the law of non-contradiction. That means that I can't. That means what? That the idea that was just espoused, if it violates the law of non-contradiction, it can't possibly be what? It can't possibly be true, because if it's true, then it's what? False. Right? If it's true, then it's false. If I can't speak a word of English, if that's true, then what I just said is false, which makes no sense. Right? That's completely, what we would say is incoherent. Because the reason we get tripped up on this stuff, and we're going to see this time after time after time in this class, how some of the most brilliant, most intelligent, intellectual, articulate philosophers and scientists and whoever else throughout the history of the world up until now have violated this simple principle right here, which makes their whole entire philosophical structure what? Crumble, right? It doesn't matter how pretty it is, and how nice it is, and no matter how good it looks over here. If you've got a house of cards, and they're all freaking, beautiful and look great and all this kind of stuff, and I take the bottom one, hold the whole thing up, and goes, what does it matter? How much does it matter how pretty all this was up here? Irrelevant. Why? Because it can't stand, right? It can't withstand its own weight, right? Does that make sense? So if I build an entire theory, like postmodernism, because everybody wants to say that, like, what are you guys, freaking millennials? Isn't that what you guys are? Everybody wants to say that millennials are postmodernists. No, they're not. No, you're not. Like, you have that label, but every day you're going to use what? You're going to run around using this, knowing this to really be what? Representative of what reality is. But they're going to give you the label, or you'll adopt the label a lot of times. You're postmodern. Because postmodernism says, generally, again, oversimplification, that postmodernism says what? There is no truth. Right? Now, take Aristotle's little tool belt, or take his little tool bag right here. Apply the law of non-contradiction to the statement, there is no truth. There is no truth. Is it true that there's no truth?
Yeah.
Because if it's true that there's no truth, then it can't be true that there's no truth, because there's truth that there's no truth. But if it's true that there's no truth, then there's truth. So there has to be truth, and there can't be no truth. You see how that just whole system. Your system here, your entire postmodern system about how truth can't be, there's no such thing as true. I don't care how pretty it is and how elaborate it is, and now there's 20 extra pages on it. If the rock bottom principle what? Fails, then what? Right. Then the hell of your theory. If your theory violates this, then what? So much for your theory. Right? It doesn't matter what? How nice it is if it violates this. Now, what if someone says, I don't agree with the law of non-contradiction? I just reject that. So you're saying all this about law of non-contradiction. I just reject the law of non-contradiction. What did you say? What are they doing right now? They're using the law of non-contradiction. Why? Because at the same time, in the same way, in the same sense, they don't mean what? I accept the law of non-contradiction. So if someone says, I reject the law of non-contradiction, you say, oh, so you accept the law of non-contradiction? No, I don't accept it. No, you do accept it. No, I'm saying I reject the law of non-contradiction. Oh, so you're saying you accept the law of non-contradiction. Why? Because if they're using it, when they say they don't accept the law of non-contradiction, they're what? Using the law of non-contradiction, because they don't mean that they accept it, which is just what? The opposite, right? If they mean I don't like it, meaning I believe opposites can be true, well, if opposites can be true, well, then opposites can't be true. Because the opposite of opposites can be true is just what? Opposites can't be true. So if someone were to say, I think opposites can be true. Opposites can't be true. This guy cannot disagree now. You see how that's incoherent. Opposites can be true. Oh, opposites can't be true. Yes, they can. Opposites can be true. Opposites can't be true. Nobody's saying anything. That's like -1, +1. Just completely equals up to 0. Now, the reason people, again, get tricked with this is because grammatically it makes what? It makes sense grammatically to say BS, like opposites can be true. In the spiritual realm, opposites can be true. Things like that. That sounds grammatically what? It works grammatically, but logically, what happens? That's like me saying, it's just incoherent. It's just nonsense. It's just stupid, right? So like when, again, right down the road, words are very unnecessary. Wait a minute. Or even another way, like, man, I just love the Beatles, right? I listen to the Beatles. One of their songs was, all you need is love. Now that isn't directly self-defeating, because this is the term we use When something violates this, we call it self-defeat because it defeats itself. Sometimes you hear it's called self-stultification because it stultifies itself, or it's self-retarding because it retards itself. It's just it completely implodes. It just brings itself down, right? It won't work. So there's an old Beatles song that isn't necessarily directly self-defeating. It's not as bad as saying there is no truth, which literally contradicts itself, right? But there's a song that says, all you need is love. Well, wait a minute. If that's true, if it's true that all you need is love, then you also need what? What? If it's true that all you need is love, you also need truth. Right? You can't say all you need is love. Is that true? Yes, it's true. Well, then you need truth just to even say what? That all you need is love. So you can't just need just love. You must at least have what? At the very least, what? Truth and love. At the very least, right? Why? Why would you at least need both of those? If that was even true to begin with, why would you at least need both of those? Because you can't even say all you need is love without it being what? True. But if that's true, then you have to have what too? Truth. You have to have truth. If there is no truth, if you just need love and not anything else, well, if it's true that you need love and nothing else, then you also needed what? Truth. Truth being just as equal as what? Love. In order for you to even make the statement. Does that make sense? All right, now, so let's look at some of these other self-defeating statements. Because see, right now, what I'm doing is we're arguing for the correspondence theory. That's what we're doing. We're trying to say that what we're saying matches reality, right? That what we say corresponds to reality. That this has to be the truth. So the law of non-contradiction, let's look at that. Let's say, I'm trying to just toss up a bunch of, hip, cool, and relevant cultural slogans here, because I'm not hip, cool, relevant anymore. That train left me a long time ago. So what you might hear is something like, truth is relative. Truth is completely relative to the individual. Truth's relative. What's wrong with that? Remember, right now, all we're doing is holding up these popular sayings for what? The law of non-contradiction. So when someone says truth is relative, is that relative?
Is it relative to truth is relative?
Right. If it's true, if truth is relative, then that's not a relative truth. That's a truth that's true for every single person at every single time for every single period, right? But that's not a relative truth then anymore, is it? That's a what? That's an objective or absolute truth, right? That's an objective or absolute truth. Because if you say truth is just relative, was that true for you? Is it true for her? Yes, true for her. True for her. True for her. True for her. We go through every single person in the universe, then it's not relative anymore. If it's true that truth is relative, then that's true for everybody, right? Regardless of what they believe. Let's say you've got the radical fundamentalist over here says truth is not relative, truth is absolute. And the guy over here says he just doesn't know that truth is relative. Well, if truth is relative, that's true for him, whether he what? Believes it or not, which means that it's not relative. Does that make sense? Why? Because it violates what? It violates the law of non-contradiction. You can't run around saying that the truth is relative when you're trying to get, let's put it this way. A lot of times people work this way, maybe easier to understand. There are no absolute truths. Because saying the truth is relative is just another way to say that. They might say, there are no absolute truths. What's wrong with that?
Not an absolute truth. They said that in their statement. It's not absolute.
Right. If you say there are no absolute truths, is that absolutely true? Because if it's absolutely true that there are no absolute truths, you see what happens? There are no absolute truths. Is that absolutely true? Because if that's absolutely true, then what do you have now? An absolute truth. But if you have an absolute truth, then you can't say the truths aren't what? Relative. You can't say they're relative. You can't say that there are no absolute truths because you just made an absolute truth claim. The only way to get around an objective truth claim, when I say objective, I mean overarching, true for all people at all places at all times. The only way to get over an objective truth claim, there are no objective truths, is to do what? To make an objective truth claim. You just don't see that you're doing it because it makes sense grammatically, right? But it's violating what? The law of non-contradiction. You're contradicting yourself. Think of it this way. There's no single truth that's true for all people. Is that true for all people? Because if it's true that there are no truths for all people, then you just made a truth that's true for all people. Right? See how that contradicts itself? It's completely contradictory. Now that's why Aristotle says, look, since you can't get around it, you can't make a claim against the law of non-contradiction because you have to do what? You have to assume it, right? In order to say you'll agree with it, you're literally having to use it. Then what has to be true? What has to hold? This fundamental principle, right? This fundamental principle of reality. And then it's related brothers here. The law of excluding middle and the law of identity, which we'll get to probably some later time. Now, how might this come? Yeah, I'm trying to look at this stuff to stay on track with you guys. Because man, this is probably one of my favorite subjects to talk about is just truth. And I don't want to get too off topic. I'll stay on track for you guys. What is another way you see? What is another way you hear these cultural type claims that go against truth? What's the more layman's level of saying some of the same thing we're saying right now about truth being relative, that there are no objective or absolute truths? You might hear what? You might hear that truth is just determined by your culture, right? Have you ever heard that? Guys, truths are determined by your culture. What's wrong with that? Remember, just take that claim and look at it in light of what? Law of non-contradiction. So if I say that, well, look, man, the truth is just determined by your culture. What happens when this reflects it back on itself? If it's true that the truth is determined by culture, then what? Then that's a truth that's not what? And that's a truth that's not determined by culture, right? If someone says truth is just determined by culture, is that true for this culture? Is it true for this culture, and this culture, and this culture, and this culture? Is it true for all cultures that truth is determined by culture? Because if it's true that truth is determined by culture, then that's true for every culture, whether what? And believe it or not. Contradicts itself. You can't say that truth is determined by culture and then say that's true for all cultures. You've just contradicted yourself. Again, that's just bad thinking. Not just bad philosophy, it is, but to put it in layman's terms, it's just bad thinking. Again, why do people fall for that stuff? Because it makes sense what? Grammatically, right? But it doesn't make sense what? Logically, philosophically. Right? Another way is, what if someone says, truth is just determined by your perspective. Now, your perspective is what determines what truth is. Why does that follow? Why is it self-defeating? What's that? Or that would have to be true despite their what? Right. If it's true, if someone says truth is just determined by perspective, was that true for everyone? Because if it's true for everyone that truth is determined by perspective, then it can't possibly be true that truth is determined by perspective, because you just gave a truth claim that's not determined by what? Perspective. You said it's true for everyone, regardless of their perspective. You just made another what? Absolute objective truth claim. Right? Let's put this in an easy way. Truth is just determined by the country you live in. We're just saying the same thing in different ways, right? Truth is just determined by the country in which you grew up. Well, one, you would like to know how they figured that out, right? Because they grew up in some country, so how do they know that, right? Two,
If truth is just determined by the country in which you grew up, is that a truth that's true, objectively speaking, absolutely speaking, for everyone else? Well, then what does it mean to say that? It defeats itself. It falls on its own sword, so to speak. It literally, let's go back to Looney Tunes again. You remember when Elmer Fudd would always be hunting, Bugs Bunny or whatever, running around after him. You remember how sometimes Bugs Bunny gets a little shotgun and he just hit the barrel and stuff, and bend it back on himself? Remember that? Well, then what would happen when the guy would pull the trigger? Barrel's bent this way, pointing right back in his face. What would always happen? Very second you pull the trigger, what? It just blows his face off, right? And so that's what I like to call those types of statements in light of the law of non-contradiction. I call it the backwards barrel phenomenon. So let's go back to an easy example. Let's say the law of non-contradiction essentially just makes sure that your barrel's not bending back on itself, right? So if I got a little shotgun and I say there is no truth, what have I just done? As soon as I say that, what do? Why? Because I just made truth plain. There is no truth. Is that true? Right? There is no truth. Is it true that there's no truth? Because now there's truth, right? I've just shot myself. I've just committed intellectual suicide, right? Self-defeating. It defeats itself. The claim can't stand on itself, right? And again, what we're going to do is when we talk about philosophy, as we go through all of this stuff, we're going to see how a lot of systems that people are banking on have violated this fundamental principle here. Guys, I mean, you wouldn't believe how much modern education and modern philosophy and modern belief is built directly on faulty system or a completely faulty foundation because it's violating this right here, the law of non-contradiction. Now, does this mean that you can know everything? Are we claiming that, oh man, we can know the truth about things? Because in order to say that you can't know the truth, you have to make a true claim. So, man, we can know some truth. We can know the truth. We can know about reality in some way, some shape, form, fashion. Is that trying to say, oh, you think you know everything then? No, nobody's saying that, right? Nobody's saying what? Just because you say that you can know some things about. Is that trying to say, oh, you think you know everything? No, nobody's saying that, right? Nobody's saying what? Just because you say that you can know some things about reality and then try to move from there to try to find, figure out other things about reality. Is anyone saying that you think you've got it all figured out? No. But that's often what you'll hear. Oh, so you think you know everything? No. They claim that. So I can know some things, right? Right? You can just know some things. We can do. In fact, let's get back to the death knell on all of these other theories. Remember, correspondence theory says that what? You can know something about reality, right? That there's a reality and that you can know something about it, right? All of the other theories, the pragmatic theory, that would have to be what? The truth about what? Reality, right? If the pragmatic theory represents the way things are, then that would have to be what? True about reality, right? Does that make sense? If the coherence theory, that would have to be the truth about reality, not just if things cohere, right? That would have to be that would have to be true about the way things really are. And when I say the way things really are, that's just another way to say reality, right? The coherence theory, if it's true, has to be true about the way things really are. And all of the competing theories, if they are true, they have to be true about what? Reality. So you can't say, again, here's another self-defeating statement. You will hear this all day long on Facebook, in movies, wherever you go, you will hear this. You can't know the truth about reality. You can't really know the truth about reality. What's wrong with that? Is that the truth about reality? You can't know the truth about reality. Well, how do you know that? Does that have to be a truth about reality? That would have to be what? That would have to be true. You somehow have figured out about reality that we can't know about it. How do you know that? You just said we can't know anything about reality. You see what does that do? It's self-defeating. Again, it even sounds, this is what pisses me off. It even sounds intellectual to say crap like that, doesn't it? Oh, I've studied philosophy and I have a doctorate in philosophy, and you just can't know about reality. So, how do you know that? Then how do you know that? You'd have to know something about reality in order to say that no one can know anything about reality. Because what you just said is reflective of the way reality is, right? That's why I get mad about that kind of stuff, is because anyone can walk around saying stupid stuff, sounding as if they're what? Intellectual or intelligent. When really, they don't even know the basic fundamental principles of what? Reality. Law of non-contradiction is Aristotle. Now, now do you see like the genius of Aristotle? Like, would you have ever thought about that? Like, he's sitting around one day, some guy's like, somebody says this, wait a minute. Like, he just thought this stuff. Now, did he invent it? This is very important. Did he invent this? No. Right? He what? Discovered it. Right? Because if you invent this, then what can you do? You just toss it out, right? You just come up with some other system, right? But if you discover this, it doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter what you think about it. Right? It's true whether you like it or not. Right? If this is representative of reality, then this is just true whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter what you. It's kind of like saying there's a meteor about to crash your class right now. You can't say, well, that's true for you, but not for me. All right, think that while I run out the door. You see what I'm saying? Reality is not dictated by what? Your belief about it. Think about that. Think about the stuff you hear now all the time. Think about that. You constantly hear that reality is what? Dictated by what? What you believe determines reality, right? What you believe about reality can become reality. All right, how about when I go outside and you get under your car and cut your brake lines, and then you drive through the intersection, you believe with all of your heart that what? Your brakes work, what's going to happen? Keep on believing with all your heart and crash into this car over here, right? Your belief doesn't determine, reality doesn't change, dictated on your belief. Your belief, what? Has to be in accordance with what? Reality. Reality is not what? Determined by what? Your belief. You can sincerely believe something and be sincerely what? Wrong. Right? Well, I believe with all of my heart that blah, 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 blah. Let's just do the brake line. I believe with all of my heart my brakes work. All right. I'm not going to tell you I cut them. I'm going to drop through the intersection until that happens. Your belief didn't matter. Right? Because why? It didn't match what? It didn't correspond with what? The way reality is. Right? Now, we kind of went about this reverse. And we'll talk about this again in just a second, because again, you'll hear all this stuff, all these cultural slogans and pseudo intellectual second crap. Again, like another one is that can be true for you, but not true for me. Again, that's just to say what? There's no real or absolute truth, right? There's no objective truth, but they're just violating the law of non-contradiction, right? So if someone says, that's true for you, but not for me. What is it? True for me, but not for you, that it's true for you, but not for me, that's true. You said it's just incoherent. Again, it's just like saying opposites can be true. Opposites can't be true. Yes, they can. Then why do you just disagree with it? Because I just said the opposite of what you said. Right? Say the same thing. It's just all nonsense. It doesn't stand up to logic, right? It doesn't stand up to the basics of philosophy, right? Just a basic philosophical, basic logical principle. That your belief has to be in what? Accord with what? Reality. It has to correspond to reality, right? So we're supposed to talk about, I got excited about that, we're supposed to talk about why philosophy is important. Why are we here? What are we doing in this flipping class? Like, why take philosophy? Well, hopefully, just with this first lesson, we've at least seen what? Like, why it's important. We've already talked about what, 10 or 15 popular cultural slogans that are asinine. They don't even make sense, right? Your first day of philosophy class, and we've already looked at just a few popular cultural slogans that can't possibly make any sense because they're incoherent. Right? Does that make sense? So Plato's Cave says this. Every philosophy professor, philosophy instructor always usually starts off with Plato's Cave. So I'll just go ahead and do it, not to break tradition. Plato's Cave says that he gave this allegory about philosophy. He said everybody's down in this cave. So imagine you're in this cave right now.
So essentially, right here, I want to break with the course for just a second because I'm talking about Plato's Cave. And the reason I'm doing that is because usually, again, like I stated, you don't want to break tradition and not mention Plato's Cave. But I don't want to go into it as in depth as I do there. You can check that out. You can honestly probably read it in less than 5 minutes. I had a little Freudian slip there. I was thinking of Meno, right? It was a work by Plato. But anyway, don't worry about that now. You can read it in probably less than 5 minutes. It's called The Allegory of the Cave. Essentially, it's just saying how philosophy enlightens you to the reality of the real world. Plato's going to have a different take on that than we are in this class, and most philosophers do. But the gist of it is, you live your whole life in a certain way, you get exposed to a little philosophy, and you finally get to come to the truth of what the real world's actually like. So I'm going to speed this up here. I'm going to breeze through this part and pick back up with our classroom lecture.
Try to do what? Look at the truth. Like, what's and he runs around and he does like this little
Still go.
Software science. I wouldn't say science or
Okay.
He writes his categories. Sociology around, he does like this, I'll just do this.
Okay, here we
So
go.
you come back, you're like, wait a minute, man, like, look, what about this? What about that? Everybody's like, I don't need that, I don't want to hear that. So that'll lead our last 2 minutes into this right here.
This is where we're
So
going.
why we do philosophy. The guy named James Sire runs around, he does like this, he runs around and he does like this little lecture type seminar thing where it says, why should you believe anything? And so he writes this right here. He writes his categories. Sociological, religious, what's one of the other categories he uses?
Psychological.
And philosophical or science.
Philosophical, scientific, evidential.
Say scientific. And then philosophical. You don't have to write this down if you don't want to, it's just so you can see it. And so he says, he goes up in front of the crowd and he says, why do you believe blah, blah, blah? Why do you believe, and he'll say some sort of belief. So give me some reason, guys, why people might believe certain things. What's the reason somebody might believe something?
Because they wanted to.
Right, they want
They
to.
want to see the world a certain way, if there's compelling evidence otherwise.
Right, or they just want to see the world a certain way, right? Maybe it comforts them, right?
Yeah.
So what would that fit under? Psychological, right? They believe X because it fits under some sort of psychological reason. Like that's the way they want things to be, or it makes them feel comfortable, right?
Yes.
That's why they believe it. What's another reason somebody might believe something? Any particular belief? Okay, that might be something like, let's put that under a scientific type reason. Really, that's what would be called something like hard empiricism. We'll put it over there for the time being. What's another reason somebody might believe something? Right, they're religious. Say their pastor told them that, or their mom told them that, or the Bhagavad Gita tells them that. So there's a reason they believe something because their pastor said it, or their particular holy text says it. So they might hold it for a religious reason. All right, what's another reason some people might believe something? Well, that's what your culture believes, right? Or maybe your parents believe something, right? So they taught it to you. That might be something like cultural or sociological, right? Right? Now,
we could keep going on, but I think we've got enough just to at least give our example here. Or get to the main point of the thing is this by itself? Let's say you believe X because your society believes X, right? Because your culture believes X. Your family raised you with X. Is this sociological reason by itself a good reason to hold to X? By itself. Why not?
People could be wrong, the way you were raised could be wrong.
Well, you've got, right, and you've got societies that contradict each other, right? All right, we believe that you can kill Jews. My society taught me that. We believe you can't kill Jews. My society taught me that. Well, how do you judge between which society is right or wrong if this is your only reason?
Mhm.
Because if both are going to say, well, I was raised this way, well, then what can the other guy say? I was raised this way, right? And you don't have anything to go between you, right? There's nothing to evaluate your position that's over and above your own position because you're both just saying, well, I was raised this way, well, I was raised this way. But if you've got two completely contradictory notions, then it can't be a good reason to hold to some belief just because of what? You were raised that way, or some sociological reason, right? Now, does that mean your belief is false? No. It may be true, right? But if this is why you're holding to it, that by itself is what? Not a good reason to hold to it, right? By itself. Again, are we saying it's wrong because of this? No. That would be the genetic fallacy. We'll learn about that when we talk about logical fallacies. Because your mom, your whole life, you could have grown up believing that 2 + 2 is 4, and what? It's still true, right? Just because you grew up believing a certain thing doesn't necessarily mean it's false. But if that's the only reason you're holding to it, then you're on shaky ground because there are other people that grew up in a different society or culture that believe exactly opposite than you do. Again, is what you believe false? Not necessarily. But if you're trying to say that this justifies your belief, that's not a good reason. Now, religious reasons, is that a good reason by itself that something's true? By itself. Why not?
They're contradicting religion.
Right. What if this guy says, all right, we fly planes into buildings? Because my religion says this. What if this guy says, no, my religion says we don't fly planes into buildings? Well, which one's true? Which one's true? How do you go between the two? If this is your only reason, well, my pastor said this. Well, all right, my pastor says God wants everybody to be healthy, wealthy. My pastor says God doesn't care if you're healthy or wealthy. Which one's true? Or, more radically, my pastor said God's real. Well, I'm a Buddhist and there's no such thing as God. There doesn't have to be a God involved. Which one's true? Right? So, does this mean whatever you believe religiously? Does this mean the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, or the Holy Bible, or the Quran? Does that mean that if you hold to that, whatever that belief is, does that mean it's false? If that's the only reason you hold to it, does that mean it's false?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It could be true, right? But if this is the only reason you hold to it, then what? You're on shaky ground. Why? Because what we said before, you always contradictory religious beliefs, right? So if this is the only reason, you may want to start looking around, see if you can justify what you believe, right?
Mhm.
All right, now, psychological. It makes them feel, this person wants to believe this about reality because it makes them feel a certain way. Is that a good reason by itself to accept that belief X is true? No, why not? Go ahead.
I don't know, this is kind of like a grotesque example, I guess, but there are lobbyists in the States fighting for pedophile rights. Like they want to believe like what they're doing is okay or moral, so like they're pushing,
All right. Or let's say that, let's use one just everybody relates to. I'm hoping they'll relate to. Let's say that psychologically, believing in God makes me feel I can deal with the reality if there's a God. Does that mean it's true?
No.
Right? Why not? Well, because what if psychologically I say that I believe that there's no God because now I can live my life in a way that dictates with my own moral conscience as opposed to what I feel like the Creator is telling me to do. That gives me psychological comfort. Now you've got what?
to contradictory what? Belief X, belief X is this guy believes in God because it comforts him psychologically through the hardships of life or whatever. This guy believes belief Y, that he believes there is no God because he can live according to his own dictate as opposed to some theistic kind of dictate. These contradict, do they not? But they both work for him psychologically, right? So is this a good reason to hold to something by itself?
No.
Now, does that mean it's false because you're holding to it? No. It can still be true, right? But by itself, what? It's not necessarily a good reason, right? Because why? You've got contradictory notions, right? Now, look at this right here and we'll be done. Our last little thing here is we'll kind of lump these two together. Philosophically, what if you believe something because it's logical, because you've went through arguments for and against it, because you've tried to hammer it out on the table of reason, so to speak, experience, you've pulled together the tools of science, you've pulled the tools of experience, you've pulled all of these things together to try to get to some sort of belief about reality. That still may be false, right? But is it a good reason to hold to whatever belief you have? Yeah. If someone says, why do you believe this? Well, man, I went through every single logical position that I possibly, at least to my knowledge, I could about it. I went through every argument against this. I went through every argument for it. I looked at all the data that I could possibly look at. And so I've concluded that based on all of that, that this is the best belief to hold. Is that a justified reason to holding that belief? Yeah. Now, it still could be false, right? Somebody else could come along and out-argue you, whatever. But at least now you have what? Some good reason for believing what you do. So, for instance, let's go back to this. Let's compare this to this. Hey, so-and-so, why do you believe X? My mama told me. Somebody says, well, hey, so-and-so, why do you believe X? Because I went through every argument against it, every argument for it. I've tried to look at it as completely objectively as I can, and I think that these arguments make sense. That's why I believe X. Is that a good reason? Is that better than my grandma said? Yeah. Now, again, could grandma say be true? Yeah, could be, right? But we want to get here, right? This is why philosophy is important. Because again, guys, reality is not determined by necessarily your belief. So we want to know what we can, to the best of our ability, about what? The way reality is, about truth, right? So two big things to remember. Truth. Can we know that some truths? Yes, right? Based off the correspondence theory. Why? Because that ties directly to the law of non-contradiction, right? Can't get around the law of non-contradiction because you have to use it to try to what? Get around it. The more you beat the law of non-contradiction, the more it's going to do what? Beat you. Last example, a philosopher in the 1600s said, the guy that wants to deny the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten and burned is not the same as to not be beaten and burned, right? Does that make sense? Because it's contradicting yourself. There you go with that. All right, okay, next class. We'll talk about this. Read pages 223 to 228.
Obviously, you're not going to read those particular pages.
We'll continue this kind of little discussion right here. 223 to 228. Peace out. Glad you came. Hope you had fun. Bye.
All right, so that concludes our first in-class lecture, right? So key highlights, right? We can't get around not claiming to know truth, right? Any denial of truth is going to make a truth claim. Second point, I mean, and you can listen to this again if you need to. Go back and listen to it on the podcast as you're riding your bike, working out, whatever. But also, too, the second thing we went into at the very end of the class there, usually we would do that first, is just an issue of justification. So the chart, if you hold whatever your belief is, belief X about something for just one of those reasons, well, it may not be strong, all right? You may not see an issue of epistemological justification. That is just a fancy way to say you may not have a really good warrant or a good justification for believing something. However, if you have multiple lines of reasoning to hold the belief X, then you're in a better ground there. And so the point of philosophy in this class is we want to do that, right? We want to examine different beliefs and look at why we hold different beliefs. Can we develop arguments for beliefs that we have, for things that we hold to be true, that kind of thing. All right, so having said that, we will pick up next class with just a few more words about this concept of truth, this correspondence theory of truth that we're arguing for. We'll pick that up in next class, and this is it right here. This is your sneak preview. This is what we're going to look at. All right, so see you next